He's a master tactician, an extraordinarily gifted rider, with acute judgment of a horse's pace and stamina, and a sense of when to hold back and when to surge for the winning post. But his determination to win has all too often bordered on the fanatical. And off the racetrack, he has faced disgrace and imprisonment. What drives this man? What lies behind the public face of Britain's greatest sportsman? No day better illustrates the extraordinarily contradictory nature of Lester Piggott than the 1st of June 1977, Derby Day. He'd just won his greatest ever race, securing his 8th Derby victory, beating his great rival Willie Carson by the narrowest of margins.
It's getting like a repeat performance every year. Lester, marvellously done.
Thank you very much.
You must be feeling great.
It's unbelievable.
2 hours later, Piggott and Willie Carson were competing out of sight of the TV cameras in another race, the Diamond Stakes. Lester was a Marinsky, and Carson was riding the favourite, the powerful and headstrong Relkino.
I decided to try and hold him. I did barely do a half job of holding him, and of course I was sitting on him, just barely holding him, and then I had to let him go, and I was right on the rail, and Lester was one off the rail, and I just moved up, and he saw me out the corner of his eye. He said, "You're not getting up there," so he came down to me, and of course my fella was just starting to find his stride and starting to go, and I couldn't hold him any longer, and Michael just relaxed on him, and the horse, whoa, he starts to power forward. He's a great big horse, and I was powering down this hill, just about half a furlong before Tottenham, and your man, he said, "You're not coming up there. No, you're not coming up there." And all I remember is my iron going along. It had woodwork in those days along the rails, about 6 inches of wood, all painted white paint. And I was going along, and I could hear this, and the white paint showering up, like a train crashing you. And Marinsky took a chunk at him. Lester was sort of saying to the horse, "Come on, you get a hold of him, you'll get him, stop him, come on." And that's Lester being, so... You can't get up my end of him, It's determination. It's sheer determination. He must win. He must win at all costs.
Riding on the crest of a wave is 14-year-old Lester Piggott, son of trainer Keith Piggott.
The key to the mystery of Lester Piggott's extraordinary will to win lies in his relationship with his father, Keith.
Keith knows Lester is really only just beginning, but he's shown he's a born jockey.
The facts are he was born as the only son of quite elderly parents. He was born at a time of where he was not going to mix that easily with others, because he had both a speech and a hearing impediment. But those parents had a training stable where horses were available from a very early age. Both his father and his mother's families had champion jockeys all the way back. The whole ethos of his upbringing was to get on a horse and ride it.
Lester made his professional debut aged 12, and that year rode his first winner.
We were reading about him in the papers for months, sort of thing, so we all were waiting for him to see this champion jockey. He was 12, he flew up for his first ever ride. I think I was about 18. He was very small, very quiet, sat on his own at the races, didn't talk to anybody, I don't think, the first day. Only the valet, and we were both with the same valet. He sat down one end, I sat down the other. We were both kids, sort of thing, And then he beat me a short head, so not very good with a 12-year-old beating you, is it?
Behind Lester's success lay his father's tuition. But there was a ruthless streak in Keith. He'd been a tough jockey himself and expected the same from anyone riding for him.
They just tell you be handy and, you know, don't let anybody get in your way, sort of thing. If they do, make sure that you get them out of the way.
Keith passed these tactics on to his son. He told Lester that if anyone stayed in front of him in a race, he should ride straight into the hind legs of their horse and try and lame it. He tried to toughen him up. In boxing matches in the yard, he deliberately pitted his son against older, heavier opposition.
Keith wasn't afraid of anything. You know, as a jump jockey, he wasn't the best jump in the world, but everyone said he was incredibly tough. Lester inherited his toughness. Keith wasn't going to, you know, suggest that, oh, Lester, be careful. Now, I'll bet he never said be careful to him. I'll bet he never said, you know, you make quite sure you net that nicer Gordon, which is, you know, go up your inside. I don't think you'll find that out.
Lester became known as an incorrigibly ruthless rider. Eventually, the Jockey Club suspended him for 6 months. Aged only 18, he was banned from ever riding for his father and sent from Berkshire to another stable in Newmarket. Keith was judged to have encouraged Lester in his disregard for the safety of other jockeys. In private, Lester denounced the sentence, though he said nothing publicly. After his suspension, in 1954, Lester was taken on as a stable jockey by the royal trainer, Sir Noel Merles. Their partnership was crowned with success after success. In 1957 came his second Derby win at the age of only 21. He was on Crapello, an enormously powerful colt.
And it's Crapello! And
Lester kept him tucked in until 2 furlongs out and then sliced through the field.
Crapello wins! The proud Sir Victor Sassoon leads in his second Derby winner in 5 years, and for Lester Piggott, it's 2 winners in 4 years.
But in private, Lester was battling with another demon, his weight. He was 5'7", tall for a jockey, and his natural weight was a good 2 stones heavier than his riding weight of 8.5 stone. He allowed himself half a cup of tea a day, a few scraps of protein, but no carbohydrate, and sweated off any excess pounds in a daily sauna. His struggles with his diet grew so intense that he confided he dreamt of food as he was driven the hundreds of miles between racecourses.
He always had a toasted sandwich which he took to the races with him, and literally speaking, that was all he ate, and it was just a half a toasted sandwich, and he would usually eat that as soon as he got to the weighing room or just in between the races, but that was all.
He had the force of will to do it. And what you're talking about, don't forget, is declaring war on your body. You're saying, I am not a 10-stone man. I am an 8'7" man. It's an extraordinary achievement.
But the war paid off. In his second season with Noel Merles, Lester won 127 races, among them the Oaks, Derby and 2,000 guineas, and the racing public took the tall, enigmatic jockey to their hearts.
St. Mark's, North Audley Street, with famous jockey...
Then, in 1960, in the full glare of publicity, marriage.
Or should I say handicap? The best man was John Sutcliffe, an assistant trainer. Lester's father contributed to the general racing atmosphere, and the bride was pretty Susan Armstrong, daughter of the popular Newmarket trainer, Sam Armstrong. And Lester, happy as they make 'em, passed the post with his own favourite.
But away from the cameras, a few knew that Lester was leading a very different life from the one the public saw.
I think he's always been a bit suspicious of me because I think he thinks I'm a danger to him. I would say that because he thinks I know too much, which I do, and he knew how closely I knew Charles St. George, so he knew I knew more about him than he would prefer.
The key to Lester's double life lay in his friendship with Charles St. George, perhaps the most important relationship of his adult life. St. George was a Lloyd's underwriter who maintained a string of racehorses and lived in some style in Mayfair. And Lester was to be found there almost more often than he was at home.
Lester just turned up at St. George's House the whole time, uninvited. Lester is the greatest turner-upper of anyone I've almost ever known, because no one's really ever invited him to anything. He just turns up. They don't have to. It's not because they don't want him. They know he'll pitch up. Turns up, helps himself to whatever drink. He doesn't drink much, but he would help himself to something, and then sit down, puff a cigar, and I don't know, they might have been in bed or something, and they come down there with Lester.
Upper Brook Street was Lester's haven. Here he could talk freely.
And I remember one time in particular asking him, as a sort of muck punter might do, if you're in a driving finish over a 5-furlong race, and you're next to, say, Carson and Edery, and you're very, very close to each other, and you're driving for the finish, do you ever say anything to each other, or are you, too tired, too involved in what you're doing? He thought for a moment, and he said, "Well, no, really, you're too knackered." And then a wry grin spread over his face, and he said, "That is, unless you want theirs to win, in which case you say, go on, you, go on." I asked some more similarly foolish questions, and before long Lester excused himself and went up to bed. The next time I spoke to Charles, he recounted that evening and said, "You know why Lester went to bed, don't you?" I said, "No." He said, he thought he was talking too much.
Betting by jockeys is officially banned. There's an obvious risk that they'll throw a race to win a bet. But unofficially, jockeys and owners gamble all the time, and the authorities turn a blind eye.
Charles would always tell me delightful stories of Lester taking bets and the little black book, and he'd enter the bets, and every Saturday morning Lester would go around his friends and the racing fraternity, picking up his winnings on the different bets that he'd made with his friends, including Charles St. George.
This one.
Upper Brook Street also provided a place where Lester could conduct any of his numerous affairs. Midway through the 60s, he was even implicated in a divorce case.
Susan is a very nice, good, grown-up lady, and I think she knew what Lester was like from an early stage. They got married quite young, and she'd known him a long time, and she knew his games.
Well, his reputation was, as with other gentlemen of the turf, was that no delightful young female was safe. It was all fair game. So all the stable women were open season.
Lester Piggott had another secret. By the early 1960s, he was the highest paid sportsman in Britain. But he wanted to keep his newfound wealth hidden, because he was an obsessive miser. The seeds of this problem planted as a child by his mother, who'd seen all too many jockeys fritter away the fruits of their success. She had drummed into Lester that he must hold on to his money at all costs.
People had said, "You're mean," and of course he made himself more mean because people said he was mean. He would always try the tricks of not paying the taxi, getting somebody to buy him an ice cream. It's all a game. He loved it.
He'll take anything that's free that really would be more trouble carrying than worth it. I don't know, knives and forks and aeroplanes. It's pathetic things, but that is him. He can't help himself. It's very strange. Yeah, it's almost as if he lives in an enclosed personal society, and he does these things that shock people, but he can't help himself.
I know that Bill Pyers, he used to change money for Lester in France. Lester would give him a bundle of £100 notes £10 notes, and you know how they wrap the outside one round. Well, Bill only discovered after about the fourth lot he'd changed that Lester always nicked one tenner out of it and gave Bill 90. Then when Bill went to change it, he suddenly turned around and saw Lester grinning all over his face.
He thought it was funny. He'd go around the corner giggling, you know. Yeah. Of course, to me, to you, it's silly, you know. Not very funny, but to him, it was great fun. Aye, that's him, you know. That was him. He got his pleasure out of cheating somebody out of sixpence. That was the game.
Money is his god, a cliche, yes, but I can't think of a better way of putting it. Every day of his life, when Lester wakes up, I think he's thinking of how he can make some money.
Lester's obsession fed his desire to win. And for now it would drive him to fame, but later, disgrace. By the 1960s, Lester Piggott had established that he was without doubt the country's best jockey. But as his success grew, so did his refusal to accept convention.
There was a feeling that nobody actually had him under control. That while he had to try and respect ordinary constraints, they were only just about, and he was always about to rage against them in a way. He clearly was the bold, wild boy.
In 1967, he did something practically unheard of in the racing world. He went freelance. He'd now ride for any owner who'd pay his price. Lester didn't want to be burdened with riding a poor horse because he was under contract to a stable. He wanted to win. And in pursuit of this aim, he had no compunction about upsetting one of racing's oldest conventions. That once a jockey had been chosen by an owner or trainer to ride a horse, then that horse was his. Lester wanted the best ride, regardless.
I grew up with getting horses ready for Lester Piggott. You know, I would ride them 3 times, and then when the big day came, off, you know, here you are, Lester, steer that one round for me. And that's what I was brought up with that. As we know, he was a very good communicator on the telephone with owners or trainers. He got himself on the right horse on the big day, nearly always.
Lester was at his most persuasive, seeking out rides in classic races, deaf to protests from his increasingly angry colleagues.
It's very hurtful. It is very hurtful. It's what racing's all about, the Group 1 races, and that's the races all jockeys, owners, trainers, everybody in racing wants to win the Group 1s. That's the big thrill. And all of a sudden, 2 days, you built yourself up for this, and you've lost it.
His most ruthless unseating of a rival came when he was on the verge of claiming the record for the most classic races ever won by a jockey. The next classic was the St. Leger, and Lester had to win it. In a trial for the Leger at Goodwood, Lester was asked to take the place of a suspended jockey, Darrell McHarg, on the little-known colt, Comanche Run. But when the horse won by an extraordinary 6 lengths, Lester decided that he, not McHarg, should ride the horse in the Leger.
I assumed that Darrell would ride him. I didn't even think about anything else because Darrell was a stable jockey. And until there started being sort of rumours in the press that Lester might be riding Comanche Run. And no one told me anything. And then the rumours intensified. And so I spoke to the owner, and the owner started saying yes, that if Lester was available, he wanted to have Lester on the horse. But Lester never came round to me because he knew that it was the wrong approach to come to me, because I would have said, no, I've got a stable jockey, thank you very much, you don't ride. But going to the owner, he could soften up the owner.
Lester never pleaded. Lester argued, like, you know, you got to put me on, I've ridden so many winners for you, and I'm going to retire soon, and this is my chance to break the record. He was more or less telling me. He never asked, you know, he was trying to tell me. I remember him telling me that McHarg couldn't ride a bicycle. And if I wanted to win the Leger, I better put him up on the horse.
Well, unfortunately, I had then to talk to Darrell and tell him that I was really sorry, but Ivan wanted Lester to ride the horse, and there was nothing I could do. And Darrell was very, very laid back and very philosophical, and he said, obviously it hurt, but he said, okay, fine. And when the press asked him what would he be doing on that Saturday, he sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, I'll play tennis. And that illustrates Lester's wicked sense of humor, because when he was going to Doncaster, on the way to the races, it was pouring with rain, and Lester was reading the paper that Darrell had said he'd be playing tennis. He turned round to his travelling companion, and with a wry smile, he just said, he won't be doing that either, will he?
A furlong to go. Comanche won and Baynoon. Comanche won and Baynoon. Comanche won from Baynoon and Crazy. Well inside the final furlong, and it's Lester Piggott going on. This one for the record, the 28th Classic, as Comanche won, wins the legend.
Piggott's victory carried a price. 2 weeks later, Luca Cumani ended Darrell McHarg's contract. He was never to ride again in Britain. Lester's ruthlessness wasn't confined solely to the racetrack. One afternoon in 1976, he was being driven away from a race meeting.
As I was edging out into the traffic by the lights to get back into line again, I edged myself in front of a motorist who basically objected. By now the lights had changed, 1 or 2 cars had moved, but this motorist had turned, got out of his car and gone round to Lester's side, not my side, I was driving, and he sort of half got his arm through the window to try and get hold of Lester. Whether it was because he recognised him or not, I don't know. But anyway, Lester said, come on, let's get out of here quick. So I put my foot down quick, and it was obviously Mercedes' car, and we left the junction pretty harily, going over a red light and turning left and right again and getting out of the way.
The attacker's arm was jammed in the car window. Finally, he struggled free.
When I looked in my mirror, I saw this man in the middle of the road. And I said, oh, Lester, I said, I think he's dead. He said, serve him right. And we shot off. Well, about a week or 2 later, I received a letter of notice of intended prosecution with so many charges down that I just opened it, jumped in my car, went down to Lester, and I said, hey, look at this. I've got all this. He just said, funnily, he said, oh, don't worry about that. They always send those out.
Lester has a complete disregard for any authority or any boundaries. I mean, his home life or the revenue or stewards or riding. I mean, he rode to win. That was the essential quality that we loved.
Sangster experienced Lester's increasing waywardness at first hand. In the mid-70s, Sangster and trainer Vincent O'Bryan tempted Lester away from his freelance life. In 1977, Lester rode his greatest ever race for the partnership. Lester had already won a record 7 derbies, an achievement still not bettered. That day he was riding the Minstrel. There were doubts over the horse's stamina, vital over the testing 1.5-mile Epsom course. His main rival was drawn 5, Hot Grove, a pacey colt, ridden by Willie Carson.
I knew I was on a horse who would stay 1.5 miles and plus 1.5 miles, and there was only 2 other horses, I thought, in the race that would stay the 1.5 miles. So my plan for that day, for that race, was to make sure it was a true run race.
And they're away in the 1977 Derby Stakes.
I went very, very early, and it nearly came off until we get to, half a furlong from home, and the little white face appeared on my outside, and the whack, 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 whack I could hear.
But it's Hot Grove from the Minstrel and Blushing Broom. Then Monseigneur moving into 4th. They're racing into the closing stages now. And it's Hot Grove from the Minstrel, Blushing Broom and Monseigneur. 100 yards to run in the Derby. The Minstrel's coming to challenge Hot Grove. And it's Lester Piggott and Willie Carson. The Minstrel on the near side, Hot Grove on the far side. And the Minstrel wins it from Hot Grove, Blushing Broom is third.
The Derby Trophy is presented by Mrs. Evelyn de Rothschild to the Minstrel's owner, Mr. Robert Sangster. A happy ending to a right royal Jubilee Derby.
Fantastic jockey. Tough. he could get the best out of the horses. I mean, when he won the Derby on the Minstrel, I think he'd have been banned for 6 months for the use of the whip. But I mean, nobody else would have got him home that day. And he was simply the best.
Leicester's relentless whipping of the Minstrel aroused public controversy, but Sangster and O'Bryan condoned his tactics because he was winning so many races. That season they won the 6 major European prizes, culminating in a searing victory at the Arc de Triomphe. But in private the partnership was under severe strain. The operation was based in Ireland, at O'Brien's stables in Tipperary. Leicester's pursuit of his own interests was a constant aggravation to Sangster and O'Brien. He demanded an enormous sum of money.
I would say he'd be on $500,000. Probably 10 times more than the Prime Minister those days.
And that wasn't all Lester wanted.
Any horse that won a classic, Lester got a breeding right in, which is the equivalent of 2.5%. And let's face it, in those days, we were syndicating horses like Stormbird for 28 million, Assert, 24 million, the Minstrel was 9 million, Alleged was about 12 million. So it's mega bucks.
Him in front this time, Lester, you'll go back.
Despite the millions he'd negotiated, Lester couldn't change. He completely disrupted O'Brien's carefully planned program of gallops. Preparing a racehorse for a race is a science. A horse has to be exercised so that it's brought to peak fitness right on the eve of a race. But Lester was only interested in finding out which horse was fastest.
Vincent knew, in a way, he was wasting his breath. The top horse that Lester was riding would just bolt off at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and Lester would be trying to find out how good he was, according to how Lester seemed to think he could get to the bottom of the horse. So, of course, it would absolutely wreck the gallop.
Lester was exhausting the horses far too close to major races. They wouldn't be able to perform for the jockeys due to ride them. Of course, the horses would have recovered by the date Lester was scheduled to ride.
That was a right mess up, huh? One of the balls of a bit of work.
That wasn't all. As the world's top trainer, O'Brien's offices were a mine of information about horses being bought and sold, about profits to be sought out.
He was found looking through the offices. I mean, Lester is avaricious in his quest for knowledge. There's no private file that Lester wouldn't go through, then or now, I would suspect.
In public, O'Brien and Sangster said nothing. In private, they despaired of his behavior.
I think he thinks we're all fools.
His erratic behavior off the racetrack was now being matched on it. A steward's inquiry can cost a winning jockey a race. Lester's rough riding earned him an appalling disciplinary record. Increasingly, he would try and brazen out any questioning of his tactics.
I think he thought he was above being corrected. Certainly, I mean, he had a very cavalier attitude with stewards on race courses. I mean, I think he regarded them all as ignorant and inferior to him, which was true, they were. But he could tell so many different tales with a very straight face. Even when he stole that whip off the French jockey in Deauville, when he dropped his own whip and he nicked it in the middle of the race. He said, no, the jockey gave it. It was Alan Lecœur, and Lecœur can't speak a word of English.
Lester m'a demandé exactement la cravache et c'est moi qui lui ai remis. Et quand Lester, après, nous avons été interviewés devant les stewards, après la course, les stewards m'ont dit, mais il nous a dit que c'était lui qui vous avait donné la cravache. C'est lui qui vous a demandé la cravache. J'ai dit, mais en quelle langue? Parce que moi, je ne parle pas un mot d'anglais et lui ne parle pas un mot de français. Il m'a dit, mais tu n'as pas le droit de me faire ça, tu sais pas ce que ça va me coûter. J'ai dit, mais moi, tu sais ce que ça me coûte? Parce que tu m'as pris tellement de chevaux dans ma vie, que c'est-à-dire que quand je montais un bon cheval, il venait toujours dire, moi je le monte derrière vous, je le monte derrière lui, et tout, je vais gagner.
The point of these tactics was that Lester still wanted to win as badly as ever. And he was still showing that same disregard for the safety of other jockeys, that same desire for victory at all costs. Salisbury Racecourse is not one of British racing's major venues. It's a world away from the glitz of Epsom and Newmarket. Horses come here to try out for major races. One afternoon, Lester was racing here against Willie Carson and trainee Richard Quinn.
It was the Salisbury Guineas trial. It was a televised race. 100 yards from the start of the race, the rail came out to allow room for the camera, and the horses raced from the stalls, and as we approached the rail, it took us out, and the horses on the outside were still there, so the horses drawn 1 and 2 really run out of room. It's rather unfortunate, and Lester was drawn 3.
Lester thought that Quinny was just taking a liberty getting up his inside, and the ground was soft, you see, and we went up that far side, and the course just kinks a bit, goes that way and then comes back. Anyway, Lester's too busy watching Quinny. You know, you're not there. And of course he ran Quinny into the rail, and unfortunately the horse hit the rail, came down and got badly injured.
Well, he actually broke his back when he came down, and he had to be destroyed. I was shaken up, and I was very disappointed because he was a nice horse and he was a nice owner.
This is the worst of the accidents that have littered Lester's career. It's an extraordinarily dangerous and reckless tactic to ride one's horse into the path of another as it surges forward at 40 miles an hour. The dead horse's owner even considered suing Piggott, but the racing authorities dissuaded him. But in the late 70s, Lester was to find that the strength of brutality and a disregard for the truth weren't going to help him. He'd become an investor at Lloyd's of London, the world's most famous insurance market.
Lester was going to become an underwriting member of Lloyd's on my syndicate through Charles St. George's Lloyd's underwriting agency.
It was supposed to be a mutual deal. Lester's name would attract the rich of the racing world to St. George's syndicates, while Lester enjoyed the profits of syndicate membership. For a while, the arrangement worked. The racing and sporting establishment flocked to St. George, and Lester made a fortune.
On the many occasions I met him, he was extremely quiet, so he never actually asked me any questions whatsoever.
But his Lloyd's profits turned into enormous losses. Come Derby Day 1981, Lester was still to be found at St. George's house, but in private, the relationship was under strain. St. George's Lloyd's syndicates were in trouble. There were accusations of false accounting and mismanagement. In the world of sport, St. George's acquaintances were finding out the price of friendship ran into 6 figures. Henry Cooper had to sell his Lonsdale belt to meet his Lloyd's debts. There was one exception to the suffering. Lester Piggott refused to pay a penny.
Lester left it to Charles. Lester's view was if he got checks, he would bank them because he knew how to bank checks. But if he made losses, he would leave it to Charles.
St. George may have protected him from the Lloyd's catastrophe, and for now, Piggott's luck held. But the wealthy wouldn't be able to protect him from himself forever. '81 didn't start well. Lester was to ride Wynn's Boy in a 5-furlong sprint at Epsom.
And the horse burst out of the bottom of the stalls, and you can see that the saddle has slipped, and the jockey...
Wynn's Boy had dived under the stalls, taking Lester with him. His ear was nearly torn off, and all the bones in his back were scarred. But somehow, within 4 weeks, Piggott was back in the saddle. His determination to win as strong as ever. But another boyhood trait was to plague him that year: miserliness.
It's hard for a jockey to make, that much money because with the taxation as it is in this country, and has been in the last 10 years, it's been very bad, It's hard for even the best jockeys to save a lot of money. Well, it's well, impossible.
But Lester wasn't paying everything he owed to the taxman. His partnership with Robert Sangster was over. He'd just signed up with flamboyant trainer Henry Cecil, who had agreed to an extraordinary scheme for how Lester was to be paid at Cecil's stables.
Well, he always got what he wanted. He could command rather like Richard Burton or whatever, Clint Eastwood. I mean, he commanded the best. You won't say to me, who are you going to get over to ride next? Robert Redford.
Every owner who had a horse with Henry Cecil was sent a letter demanding an additional secret retainer for Lester, additional percentages from horses which won races and horses which were placed in races, and on top of that, breeding rights. This was money that Lester was not going to declare to the racing authorities or to the taxman. The letter ended, "When you've read this, destroy it immediately."
Henry did the stupidest thing he's ever done in his life. He wrote out this letter, and 3 or 4 of the recipients were members of the Jockey Club, which is incredible.
Unfortunately for Lester, Melvin Walters was one of those who received the letter. He was in business as a horse dealer, and he was trying to get Henry Cecil to appear as a witness in a tangled court case. He saw the letter as a means of pressurizing Cecil. In 1981, his offices were at 144 Bond Street. Melvin Walters would not appear on camera.
So I said, either you're going to get involved and give evidence, or I'm going to give the go-ahead for these letters to be made public. I was not anti-Piggott at all. It was Henry Cecil that I was upset with. And he wanted to bury his head in the sand and just go away. But it doesn't go away, does it?
Walters decided that he would make the letter public. He contacted all the major national papers. As soon as Lester heard that the letter was circulating in the media, he got in touch with Charles St. George and begged him to help out.
He did everything in his power to help Lester. Lester had done him 1 or 2 dirty tricks in the preceding period, and he completely wiped that out of his mind, and he bloody well did everything he could for Lester.
On Lester's behalf, St. George and Benson went up and down Fleet Street, trying to stop the story coming out.
It wasn't very difficult to go to Victor Matthews, the proprietor, and say, listen, I don't think we want this sort of stuff, but it's not for me to say. And he quite rightly said we wouldn't dream of publishing it. So it was then this material was being pumped down Fleet Street, and I had a very good friend who I think also dead, who was managing director of Murdoch's press, Bruce Matthews, and I went to him and said, I really don't think you, as a racing man, want this in. And he said, absolutely not, we will block it. So that ruled out the Sun and the News of the World. I ruled out the Express newspapers. The Daily Mail, the Mail Group, the Associated Newspapers, we ruled them out. They didn't want to do it. It was of Nigel Dempster persuaded the management not to. And I think we even got to the Mirror Group somehow. I can't remember how I did that.
But unfortunately for Lester, one paper in the Mirror Group decided that the story was too good to ignore. The Sunday People.
It was an obvious tax fiddle from the very beginning. The editor and I went to see Maxwell, and we sat down with him and said, look, we're going to be running this. And Maxwell, in fact, was jumping up and down in his black chair, and he even at that stage tried to write the headline for us.
The People's reporters went to Newmarket to confront Henry Cecil at the imposing Warren Place. To their surprise, Charles St. George was also present at the meeting.
He was very charming, very amenable, but he did say, in an attempt, I think, to stop the story entirely, he did say, where is this going to get us? What is the point of publishing all this?
In spite of all the efforts on his behalf, Lester was worried that the People were still going to run with the story. He took matters into his own hands.
During my inquiries, I had a call from Lester, who pretended to be a Mr. Johnson, and Lester's got this unmistakable voice, and I mean, it's not, I can't really impersonate it, but he came on like a mountain dancing here, and he was trying to find out from me how my inquiries were going. He knew that customs were involved, and he wanted to know. He was pretending to be a customs officer somewhere, and how are my inquiries going? And I think, if I remember correctly, I led him on and said they're going really fine, and in fact, you know, I think we've got enough stuff now that will put this fellow away for 20 years. And he sort of went totally silent, and then I said something like, for goodness sake, you know, Lester, you know, what are you playing at? And then he said something sort of silly and naive. He said, how did you know it was me? And I mean, it was just a nonsense.
Piggott's worries were justified. The people were determined to ignore all the pleading on his behalf.
I thought I'd had Fleet Street blanked out, and then I was on holiday in Barbados that January, and suddenly we had the dreadful news that the People, which is part of the Mirror Group, I don't know how it crept through, they ran a big expose on Lester and Cash and Henry Cecil.
Lester announced that he would retire from racing and concentrate on a career as a trainer. But off the racetrack, more trouble. At Somerset House, the Inland Revenue were already investigating racing's private practices. The People's disclosures spurred them into action. Piggott's home was raided, and then at the last moment the tax authorities offered a private deal. If he disclosed everything and paid up, there'd be no trial. To their relief, Lester agreed.
He went to his desk, took out a checkbook, wrote out 2 million or whatever the sum was, and it was passed down to the Inland Revenue, passed it down, and the man at the end of the line said, but this is not a bank that has been disclosed to us. And so there was another 2 million in another current account.
Lester is sick with money and general meanness. It's like something I've never come across. Particularly as he has, of course, got a lot of money. And he can't help himself. It's compulsory. It's like a child or an animal, even. The sort of subconscious thing that compels him.
In racing, he had got to really a stage whereby, however much he occasionally got contrary with authorities and people, he could always pull it back by going and doing something quite extraordinary on the racetrack, and everyone forgive him and say how wonderful you are. It's not the same. You know, racing authorities might forgive you, but inland revenues and people don't.
Lester was arrested. His bail set at an enormous £1 million. Charles St. George once again came to the rescue. He and Henry Cecil stood surety to keep Lester out of jail at Christmas. In private, St. George despaired of Piggott's incomprehensible behaviour. On Friday, the 23rd of October, 1987, Lester Piggott was tried at Ipswich Crown Court. He pled guilty to 10 charges of tax evasion on income totalling £3 million. In mitigation, his counsel said his miserliness was a lifelong habit drummed into him by his parents. Piggott was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Pictures of him hustled off, handcuffed to jail, were on the front page of every newspaper.
One of the great attractions and mysteries of Piggott, that in an increasingly civilized world, and not that Piggott isn't very civilized in the sense that it isn't sort of semi-suburbia in a way in Newmarket, but at his core there's something very wild, that's untamable. There was something that drove him, that would do things that no one else could even think of. The essence of the tragedy was the wild creature was locked up.
We knew he was coming, and we see him walking across from the reception with his property, baggage, carrying it himself. He was normal, like everyone else, apart from his millions, but it's no good having them where he was. And he fitted in well because he didn't get no special treatment. I think it was him, actually, that told the prison officers, don't wrap me up in cotton wool.
because he's got this mentality. He just shuts it out. No, nobody would like going to prison. Like it. But if anybody can handle it, that guy, he can handle anything. He's tough.
He used to play crib, blackjack, and I know for a fact Lester Piggott, he knows about figures and numbers, and trying to add up, he's always got 21 until one time I checked his cards, he had about 17, and it's always that smirk, give him a little smirk and his eye, and you can tell he's trying to have one over you, and if he can get away with it, he loves it. You know what I mean? He loves a little joke.
And then a further humiliation.
Lester Piggott, who's in jail for not paying his taxes, has now been stripped of his OBE. The announcement was made in...
And another problem. Melvin Walters approached Fleet Street. He had more documents about Lester's earnings. Before the papers got sight of them, Charles St. George stepped in.
They were in a safe deposit at Selfridges, and I gave Charles the key for nothing. It was only copies of cheques, tape recordings and things that didn't need to get known in the racing industry, that would have only hurt Lester, more so.
The papers stayed at Selfridges, out of sight of the media. And on Monday the 24th of October 1988, Lester Piggott was let out of jail.
It's going to depend, I think, on your behaviour. Money having been pledged, the reasonably well-behaved hacks got what they wanted, a slightly staged picture for tomorrow's front pages.
The question was, what was he to do? He decided to do what he had done all his life. Ride horses.
He was very down. And so even though a lot of people felt very bad about him coming back at the age of 54, it seemed madness. You know, and people felt he was doing things like sort of defiling his own fame.
But there was one man who didn't share those doubts. Vincent O'Bryan. At the last moment, his jockey for the richest race in the world, the Breeders' Cup, went ill. O'Bryan once again turned to Piggott.
This was 12 days since he'd come back, and he's 54 years old. So it is, at O-level maths, 42 years since he started race riding. 42 years on, since the baby-faced boy. He's now in, because of the escalation of values, it's $1 million races, in the richest race he's ever ridden in. He's last early on. You think, oh, well, you know, get it. And then suddenly, coming up the outside is Piggott. And you have that extraordinary feeling. There is the phrase I would say, it's impossible but inevitable. You can't catch one in front, but they're going to.
Finish. Lester Piggott flailing away at Royal Academy. It's all Greek to me. To the inside. Near the wire. Head bobbing finish. Royal Academy does it. And the living legend out of retirement, 54-year-old Lester Piggott pulls off the upset here.
He wouldn't have ridden a more daring, more brilliant race at his absolute peak. And to do that joined him up with his past.
He carried on riding for another 4 seasons, until he finally retired at the age of 59. But what is remarkable about Lester Keith Piggott today is how much his past still informs his present. He shows absolutely no regard for convention. He lives with his wife. But he's had a long-term affair with his secretary, Anna Ludlow. He even sold the story of the birth of their child to the Mail on Sunday for thousands of pounds. And recently paraded his son at a charity race day. For in spite of having officially retired twice, he's still riding, still basking in public acclamation, still unable to give up the passion of a lifetime.
He is very bizarre, but there you are. He's unique, brilliant at his job, but how many people were able to sort of get through to him? Not many. Through to this. No. He's got that ring of steel.
Lester Piggott was approached repeatedly to appear in this program. He refused. Then he said he would appear on one condition, that he had to be paid a small fortune.